a lot of you will have seen David's previous discussion where we're looking at a lot of the metrics involved in performance. Obviously, we're shifting gears here a little bit, but I'm imagining there's a fair bit of overlap in terms of ideas and concepts. So he's got some support here from yet another professional in Natosha. So we look forward to seeing where you guys take us with this one. So David, I'll let you kick things off.
Fantastic. Thanks, John. Yeah, I know, what was that, a few days ago, a few weeks ago, a few months ago? We talked with Lauren at James Madison going over just some different concepts. But no, what's been happening a lot really since then is we've been very busy having constant conversations with coaches, sports performance coaches, sports science, and they've been, everyone has the same concern, right? Everyone's been talking about it. This concept of treating athletes as return to play. They've had all this time off. And there are really several aspects of this. From our data side, we can speak a lot to on-court progressions, on-court periodizations. But before that, just as important in a lot of ways is what are they going to be doing, A, on their own at home. I know for compliance reasons, we can't make them do anything. We can't really monitor it much. But still, what are really solid recommendations? Again, this is high school and college and even pro level. And then when we come back, what are some strategies for progressions, again, both on the court and in the weight room? So that's why Natosha has been kind enough to join us. She's the assistant director of Olympic sports strength conditioning at Florida State University. We've been doing a lot of work together, really just in the educational front. So where I'd like to start is kind of what right now, Natosha, can you run us through what you have a lot of your athletes doing at home, kind of the basics of what they're doing at home, how other people can do it, and then the why behind it.
Right, for sure. Well, I think the biggest thing we've kind of touched on is getting a feel for what equipment we have available. Right, we run the spectrum as a group right now between, I have an entire weight room coach and I have 30 yards worth of turf, and I have my apartment and a concrete slab outside. So making a spectrum of programs that kind of run along that thought process, with the focus being on what is the best way to maintain the qualities that we were training prior to you leaving. So from a strength perspective, what is the best way for us to maintain that? How can we build you some resiliency in this time that, quite frankly, if we were on campus and doing a normal volleyball workload, we wouldn't be able to do, really, because we'd be kind of counteracting our level of resiliency with what's happening on the court. So we've almost tried to take it as an opportunity to build some resiliency that we wouldn't have had through like isometrics and some tendon protection stuff that we can get into. But I think the biggest thing we've kind of touched on is continuing to keep our tendons healthy by exposing them to a volume of what we call intensive jumps over this time period. So this idea of like, it doesn't necessarily have to be maximal jumps all the time, but our tendons respond a little bit better to a continuous progressive workload over a period of time, as opposed to do a lot, do nothing, do a lot again. It will perceive a little as a lot if you don't do anything between now and when we come back. So we've put a real big emphasis on jumping extensively, and I'm going to put my YouTube channel in the chat so people can kind of see what I mean by that. We call it like tissue prep, but it's essentially just plyometrics of various types. So we've focused a lot on those type of jumps, like extensive plyos, and then we've also focused a lot on, like I talked about, like tendon resiliency. So from a standpoint of like, all right, I'm a setter. I am probably a little bit more susceptible to like Achilles tendinopathy. all right, here's what I want you to do. Here's what we call it, like our shin circuit, so to speak. Same thing for hitters and your general patellar tendinopathy issues. Here's how we're going to mitigate that. But again, I think the biggest point has been this load management, for lack of a better term, of, no, guys, we need to continue to jump. I'm not saying go out there and maximally jump 800 times on concrete, but we need to continue to jump, and then the volume of that will increase as we get closer. But we also need to continue to stop or decelerate under the speeds that we would see on the court, because that's going to be the toughest part, right? Whether it's libero or hitter or whatever, like if the first time we see the type of like landing, stopping actions that we're going to see in practice or in a match is when we get back, however long that is from now, that's probably going to be problematic. So we've come up with a couple of different strategies for that, whether it be like landing, some short space agility, different plyometrics.
Yeah, and I know you walk through a lot of those on your YouTube channel so that people can see it. I think what's important to note here, and I think people are really realizing this, is we're not so concerned about the strength muscle capacity side, right? When it comes to both acute, but really a lot of those chronic issues that Natosha mentioned, those patellar tendinopathies, it's that tendon capacity that we're worried about, right? And so what we want to make sure that programs understand, especially programs who may not have, a strength or sports science department. I mean, even high schools, we're doing a lot of stuff with high school programs as well, but understanding like, all right, we need to get them jumping. The last thing we want to do is have them come back and have them start, popping into depth jumps like high intensity plyos. Because then what that'll do is it's phenomenal for building that muscular capacity. But then when you have this imbalance or distance between your muscle capacity and that tendon capacity, and you have these really strong muscular loads that are pulling harder on the tendon than it can handle. And that's when you start to get those inflammations and dysfunction. So those simple movements, those simple things, I think can be done right now when they're coming back in. So when the athletes do get back, we've been looking at a lot of different research in terms of, all right, you can't assume they've all done everything Natosha has told them to do, right? Because we can't necessarily objectively measure that on everybody. So the next thing I'm going to pull up is I'm going to start talking about progressions, like the history of periodization in mainly D1 volleyball, and then how we suspect that will change. So I'm going to share my screen here. Give me a second because I've got about 1,000 things open. So we've been, I know, John, I told you about this kind of for fun. We've been looking at just past data and creating some pretty cool reports. So can you see that right there? It says Fall Practice Data Review.
Yep. So
what we're looking at here is, again, this is average. We took this from, I believe it's between 30 and 50 Division I teams for this particular report, teams that did a phenomenal job of collecting data. And it's fascinating because we're looking at the periodization. And as you can see here, in August, we have a lot of our two-a-days. We start up. You have, 2.5, 3 weeks before match play. What you tend to see oftentimes is, not all, but some programs tend to cram in quite a bit. John, I think Mark had mentioned in another talk that they don't even start jumping when he first gets the athletes for a few days.
Yeah, well, that's the advantage of being a professional team who's got like an 8-week preseason.
Exactly. I want to talk about that because the thing is, even though the 2.5, 3 weeks is never ideal, a number of coaches had actually requested some data from us to present to AVCA to then present to the NCAA, saying like, what should or can we change? And we went through different progressions and periodization schemes to kind of optimally allow programs the time to not have to rush, especially this year. And we were recommending at least 5 weeks to bring it back. I mean, a lot of these athletes, you're training like a pro athlete in a lot of ways, but then you also have school and you have these demands on your body, and yet you're given, look at the NBA, for example, right? 18, 19-year-old kids, rookies in the NBA, yet they have 10 to 12 weeks before training camp even starts where they can train. And there's a reason behind that. So the reason I brought this up is because I think there's a chance, especially if we have time to bring the athletes up, where we might see a bit of a flip of this periodization, where it will almost look exactly the reverse. I know my last call I went over a little bit of acute to chronic workload ratios, but to briefly review that, the idea is to make sure we minimize that imbalance between tendon and muscle capacity, and we grow the athletes efficiently. You need to do that. We're looking at ideally a 10 to 15% growth week over week of load on the court. And theoretically, and not just theoretically, we've seen this with numerous programs, we have them jumping more in October and sometimes even in November, and also jumping higher, right? So show you another one here. This was an internal study we did on spring programs. All right, should say optimized performance. Everybody see that?
Yep.
All right, awesome. So we did this with, I want to say, close to 20 programs. And we took about half of them that started very low during the spring, and then half of them that started very high with more of the let's get at it mentality versus the God knows what they've been doing over winter break, let's start slow mentality. And the results were fairly comical. And what I mean by that is with the programs that started, again, sometimes as low as 50 jumps, they would grow week over week, nice and strategically, and we would see on average about a 1.3 increase in team vertical. The ones that did the opposite, they didn't go down in the low, but they start really high, then go low, and then kind of pop up high again and drop back down. Not so much strategy or progression. On average, they had a 1.2 decrease in vertical. And so we're going to continue to harp on this whole muscle tendon thing because the reason behind that decrease in vertical, a lot of variables. One of them could very well be the simple fact that, all right, if we have that massive imbalance and there's strain on that tendon, you have that energy storage tendon that's going to return that force and help with ground reaction force. And if that's fatigued and there's dysfunction there, yeah, you're not going to be as explosive. You're going to require more eccentric load, get deeper into your jumps, all because we rush them on the load side. And Natosha is actually going to go into more specifics now on this same kind of topic. But this is very neat to see, and I'm actually very glad that we have this kind of data. So even if people, obviously not everyone can objectively measure, but at least there's this guide to say, all right, let's take our time bringing them back, because you can start too fast and really suffer for the rest of the season versus starting slow and frustratingly not getting the reps you may want, but it will pay off in the end.
Yeah, and I think, and I'm going to kind of share a visual just so we can all have an idea of kind of what we're thinking about from a load perspective and kind of what that progression is going to look like. So what I think is important to recognize about this chart is it doesn't necessarily say like no high intensity work. It's just that the volume of high intensity work relative to the low intensity, what we would call in strength and conditioning general preparation, is small relative to the general preparation. So I think the biggest thing that we can all kind of agree with is when we come back that the athletes we're going to get back won't be the same ones we sent home. like they're not going to have the capacity that we sent them with. And I think an important thing to remember in all of this is they wouldn't anyway, right? This idea of like in the spring, we were going to build a capacity and then we're just going to come back in the fall and it's going to be there. Like that was probably never a realistic way to kind of think about it. But I think what this visual kind of shows us is like from an intensity standpoint, and I think that intensity it's a curved line when it honestly is going to be squiggly relative person to person. I think the volume is the most important part, right? whether it's low intensity work or high intensity work, the volume can't start high. So even on my end, even on the strength and conditioning side, I can't go into it like, this is low intensity relative to what they're going to do on the court, so let me just smoke them, right? Like that can't happen. Like from a global perspective, I think the tact that I've taken, and I'll stop sharing my screen. I think the tact that I have taken is, all right, what did we miss? Like what, and again, just like David talked about, everything's going to depend on time. And then from a strength and conditioning perspective, what did we miss? How can I try to make up for that from a standpoint of, all right, when's the last time our ladies squatted to depth? What is our movement capacity? So we talk about work capacity and jump volume and things of that nature, but like, where is our strength levels? So tendon capacity is important, but if we have no strength, it's also going to be problematic from a injury preventative perspective in protecting our ligaments and things like that. And so that's one end of the spectrum, right? Like we're going to do 2 or 3 maximal jumps and everybody's going to be landing unbelievably heavy. Not everybody, but if somebody hasn't either A, done it, or B, did no strength training over that entire time, the reserve of max, let's just call it capacity of, or power capability that they're going to have is going to go super quick, right? So what we can't do, even if we're doing a low volume of things, whether on the weight room or the court, is go in and attack it from a standpoint of like, all right, everybody in here knows how to jump. So let's just go maximal jump and then we'll build that volume up. I'm taking the tack, honestly, in my first week, we're not going to do any maximal jumping. Like, show me your very basic movement skill, and we'll be strategic about trying to add in capacity in other ways. Like, right, like, can you still squat to depth like you could when you left? Cool, box checked. Can you still decelerate the way you did when you left? Cool, box checked. Now let's build the volume of that in. And obviously that's where having a strength coach work with sport coaches is going to be vital through this whole process. And if you're somebody that's running all of it, I just think conservative approach will always be better. Make sure your athletes, it's going to look different for everybody. That's the tough part of this. But you'll know your athletes. You'll know what they were good at, what they were bad at, and then let that be your guideline and your baseline for what you build them back into. But just remember, you're in season. In a perfect world, it's still a time where you can theoretically build their capacity, just like David just talked about. You do not have to get back what you lost in a week or 2 weeks or however much time you have. The mindset of a lot of people will have to change. It's like we get in season, we stop doing hard stuff. Well, that's not going to be a luxury, I think, that a lot of people are going to have because you didn't have time to build that resiliency prior. So remember, in season, if done strategically and done well, you can still, both in the weight room and on the court, safely build in capacity for people. Just so, you know, I think the biggest thing I can say is, like, don't feel like you got to make up for 4 months of lost time in the 2 weeks you're going to try to get prior to play.
All right, Natosha, we had a question come in from Simon. He wanted to know about, with respect to your chart, is that including ball practice or just strength and conditioning?
And I'll share my screen again. I think both, right? Like, so I'm looking at it low intensity work in the weight room and on the court, right? Like, there's probably a volume of passing reps that we could get in our low intensity work that won't be very dangerous, but will still be unbelievably useful for us from a rep perspective. So I think of it as those two sections, the blue and the yellow, encompasses the weight room as well as the court. So high intensity stuff on the court, how much hard stopping, cutting, jumping are we doing? Low intensity stuff on the court, how much standstill passing, hand position, like just like setting up our like defense, things like that are we doing, right? Those that categorically can fit into those things. And from a strength and conditioning perspective, low intensity, how much minimal volume plyos, how much movement still, that type of stuff relative to, all right, how much maximal jumping, how much actual lifting are we taking into account? So I would consider that a chart and a guidance for both the weight room and the.
Okay, very good.
Yeah, and I think to piggyback off of what Natosha said, especially with when you do have them come back, they're doing too much, and part of that muscle capacity and strength is it's so much easier for the athlete to go out there and maximally jump, and from the eye test and even the data test, like, oh yeah, man, they can still get up there. But as a visual to what our concern is, so everyone kind of see this. So the black lines, these are jumps. The red lines, these are landing impacts, right? So we can see, I guess for those not familiar, this is where you have the sensor around the waist. We can measure how well an athlete attenuates that ground force up to center of mass. But this is Division I athlete, and this is just an assessment, but it's basically a microcosm of what we've been talking about, is when the athlete fatigues muscularly, right? You can see the jumps are starting to go down a little bit, and what compensation is happening in the red on landings? They about double by the end of this 7 or 8 minute assessment, right? And so this is a good visual of what can happen, and all this is showing us, I guess, to give a riveting live demonstration here because we're on video. Take this out real quick. Here, what we're looking at there is the difference, as simple as it is, between someone landing here with good flexion at the ankles, knees, and hips, and someone saying, oh, I'm getting tired, I don't like this 1/8 or quarter squat. They want to take that co-contractile force away, relax the muscles, so they say, let me put pressure off the muscular structure and onto my skeletal structure, which is the opposite of ideal from both a chronic and acute injury standpoint. But it's fascinating, and I hope my voice didn't change too much taking out the earphones or earpiece, but it's fascinating to see the incredible difference in the amount of impact that makes its way up to the hips and back with a couple degrees of flexion at that hip hinge. Like it's wild. I know, Natosha, you do a fairly asinine amount of work on that one piece.
Yeah, no, that is something that it's hard to explain, but right, like what you just demoed, that's a really simple thing to kind of conceptualize. But now fit that around a 6'4" middle with legs that take up like 75% of her body, and teach her to get into that position. Well, that's going to look different on her than it did on you. And so it's trying to get everybody to understand that the point at which you need to get flexed and what that means for torso, for hips, for back, for knees is different for everyone. So we teach a loading strategy that's the same for everyone, and then let them fit it around their own ideals, with the understanding that like y'all aren't going to all land the same, and that's okay. You just need to be able to attenuate force for you. And that is a rabbit hole we could really, really go down. But I think how that relates to this is like, you could, I know for me in my brain, I love my athletes, and I believe we are fully bought in and we listen. And I know they know how to land, but I have no guarantees that whatever they're doing at home is what I told them to do. Like, you know what I mean? Or in the way that I told them to do it. What I think we're going to all find through this process is like, it's not that they didn't do what we told them to do. It's that they didn't do it the way we told them to do it. So like the intensities, the speeds, the forcefulness, the hip angle, the torso angle, like all of that has to be checked. It's why strength coaches exist. If not, we could just give people a program and be like, go do your thing. So that is honestly something to keep in mind when people come back. You did what I told you to do, but did you do it the way I told you to do it?
Well, on top of that, Natosha, too, the other thing that you've brought up several times in other conversations is because they're on their own, they can only do this in a ideal, controlled situation.
Exactly, yeah. Like, we've talked a number of times about, okay, if let's say worst case scenario, I don't get them back until 2 or 3 weeks before the season starts. I need to start adding chaos into their stuff like in June. Like, you know what I mean? In June and early July. And what I mean by chaos is like, all right, right now, the stuff you'll see on that YouTube channel is a lot of straight lines, a lot of go forward, stop, and cut at a 90-degree angle. Jump, land, shuffle, jump, but go forward. There's not a ton of what we call open skill or a ton of variables. I'm really hoping we get them back in enough time. But it would be a disservice to the team if they came back and it's like, well, you did all the jump stuff, but there was never any element of something closer to volleyball specificity in that jump stuff and in that movement stuff, because it's going to put them in a really bad spot when it comes time for us to see a set, go hit the ball, land, get off the net. Like, if we don't see some variety of that now, or at the very least as we get closer, it's going to be tough. So that's just where being creative is going to be important. Yeah,
because that's so unbelievably hard for. I was on a call with another program, and it was a hilarious question one of the athletes asked. They said, all right, so I have three options. I have loose rocks in my driveway, concrete, and a dock. What should I jump on? It's like,
what you tell her?
well, after going over all of the safety things, so please be safe, check this, and then theoretically, if we're doing jumps and you're going to have more volume, if your dock isn't full of splinters and have missing pieces,
what are we with the dock too?
And we're going with the dock.
What are we with the dock?
If you're doing some like lateral agility stuff, okay, maybe go on the concrete so we don't trip. I don't want you sliding around on loose gravel. Yeah. So you're going to have to change your environment depending on what you're working on. But that's the reality. There's another girl who's 6'5", and she joked on the video call. She's like, yeah, so about getting maximal jumps in the house, I've got 10 inches max before my head hits the roof. So it is so crazy you talked about this, and I've been playing around with, like, how do we get this done? And fun way to do it, if you have a band, any type of, like, band or even just a really long beach towel, tie it around something sturdy in the house or right outside the house, you can do a lot of what amounts to, like, maximal jumping with that towel tied to something and then that wrapped around your waist so you can still get some forward momentum going in a way that's necessary to maximally jump without actually having to travel, and so the landing impacts aren't as, like, gnarly. But, hopefully that's a last resort. Yeah, right. No, it's the other thing too, and you probably have some of this on your video piece too, but the whole idea of almost treating it like an Olympic lift where you're kind of hitting that back extension, driving into the ground, but not jumping. Yeah, no, it's we have done stuff on that. I know that's a hard thing for people to conceptualize, right? Honestly, some of the best stuff you can do, if you got an old duffel bag, fill it with dirt, something you don't mind tearing apart. Fill it with dirt and launch it. Throw it as high as you can. It forces this triple extension and this explosive training without having to actually leave the ground. But then the issue you come in with there is, like, you can probably keep up some of the power and strength aspects. The tough part is if you did all that and then you came back and you jumped 30 times for the first time, and even if they weren't maximum, 30 times for the first time in 3 months, your Achilles and your patella tendon would light on fire. Like, you know what I mean? So you have to still find some decelerative components, whether in the jumping or in agility or different things like what I have on my channel. That stuff's important. Yep, for sure. Yeah, that's the majority of what we wanted to run through, John, in terms of just different progressions. I don't know if you had any questions or anything else you'd like myself or Natosha to clarify.
We had a question come in from Michael, who was talking about when he first gets his athletes back at the beginning of preseason. He says, when we first get them, we test before we start training to find a starting point. We jump test vertical and horizontal, run what I guess he calls it a 7, which is 7 sidelines, side-to-side tests. He's wondering if that's a good or bad thing to do.
Dave, you want to take that one first, and I'll come in after?
Well, you and I are going to say probably a lot of the same things. I'm gonna start with, and this is a challenge that not a lot of people can get over just because maybe it's bandwidth and budget. But I like to start with counter movement jump height as a measure, and it's a good baseline. The thing we need to be careful about though is when we look at just like a counter movement jump height or just like a standing jump, right? Load and explode. You can have athletes who are under fatigue still be able to get kind of a max load. Now, we're not looking at athletes under fatigue necessarily, but the one thing I would caution about there is, and again, I don't know where Michael's from or what he has in terms of technology or facilities, but Natosha, you talk about it a lot more because you do a lot of work with force plates. But one of the things we found is, yeah, you might see, cool, they're jumping high. And again, I'm not saying not to do this. I think you should. It's fine. But their eccentric load phase, like how deep do they need to get in order to jump that high? That's something that might change over time or will change as they get stronger. And yet you might not even see a higher jump necessarily, if that makes sense. So there are some pieces there we have to just be careful of, and don't ever think of that as an end-all, be-all on their jump height piece. Natosha, you can take over from there.
Yeah, so, and you know, we're kind of debating / thinking through the pieces of that too, like creating a baseline. How do I know if they're getting better? Here's what my thought process is on that. I am going to advocate, and obviously a lot of this has to do with the coaches and what they want to do, but I am going to advocate for us not to do any baseline testing until, in a perfect world, 2 weeks after I get them in. Because I don't know if their baseline is actually, the baseline you're going to get the day you get them back is actually representative of what their capacity is. So, or not capacity, but even like true power and strength output, because you have no control over what happened prior to that, right? Like, so how often do we see an athlete come in, train for a week or 2 weeks? And when I say train, I don't even mean like maximally strength train. I mean like, hey, let's move around some. And because they haven't, and because they haven't done anything in a couple of weeks, they just feel better, they move better. Not to mention, so we're going to counter movement jump test, and I have a force plate, so I probably will do it on that. But even if you're using a VERT or just having them jump and chalk mark a wall, what we got to remember about a counter movement jump relative to an approach is a counter movement is a little bit more muscularly focused, right? It is a better representation of strength. An approach is a little bit more of a better representation of tenderness. It is a lot less more control. So I guess to answer the question, whether you should or whether you shouldn't, I know I probably will advocate for us not to, because if you want to get a true measure of how fast are we running, what's our agility look like, conditioning test, I'm not going to have us do that for at least a couple weeks. And obviously I'm in a fortunate position. We have devices that can kind of tell us their heart rate and kind of work from there. But from a deceleration perspective and agility or jumping or whatever, if I can't guarantee, which in my position I can't, if I can't guarantee that they've done that before, one approach jump is all it'll take. If that's the first time that they have really maximally transferred horizontal to vertical, jumped up and landed with a ton of force, then it's still too risky, in my opinion, particularly if they're doing that 2 or 3 times. It's the first time they've done it. A counter movement jump is much more controlled, so we will counter movement jump, but we won't probably do an approach. And I'm going to say it's the same concept with the agility. It's still a ton of go real fast at the top. And it's stuff that I'm telling them to do right now, but I can't guarantee it. So until I can guarantee that we can do that stuff under my supervision, then A, I don't know how awesome the testing would be anyway. But B, I think it's a little bit more risky than I want to be, and maybe that's being overcautious. But I think that's what this situation is going to force us into. Okay. So long story short, it's probably going to be like 2 weeks before, at least 2 weeks before I start doing any type of testing. And honestly, conditioning is it's one of those things. Like, capacities take time to build. Aerobic capacity takes time to build. Or the capacity you need to play volleyball takes time to build. And we need to be chasing very specific capacity. We probably need to be careful about chasing, like, I want us to be able to run this distance because it's our conditioning test we've always been. Well, that goes back to, like, we missed that block of time that we would have been, quote unquote, training for that. So, like, what do I need to be very specific about attacking what we need to be able to do on the court?
All right, since we're talking about conditioning tests, you might know where this is going. What are your thoughts on the mile run as a test for volleyball?
Oh, is that toward me? We don't do it.
I wouldn't. Yeah.
We don't do it. So here's the thing. I think everything is about knowing what you are testing and why, right? Like, the problem is in my environment, my coaches, and I'm fortunate, my coaches say, I want us to do the stuff that makes us better at volleyball. In other people's environment, if you're like, I want us to do the mile run because I believe it's a mental toughness, I don't agree with that, but we need to, like, if my coach told me if we had to do it, I guess, like, we could do it, but I would need to make it clear to them, this has nothing to do with how good we're going to be at volleyball. You know that, right? And if they were like, we don't care, then I'd be like, okay. But no, we don't do, our conditioning test is a 200-meter shuttle, and to be totally honest, we don't use that very often either. The closer we get to the season, the less we do light running. So that's
I'll give you a quick story, and same page, but a colleague of ours, Bill Ferran, he's the strength coach for Miami Heat. He used to be the strength coach for, sorry, Natosha, but the Miami Hurricanes football. And so, but one of the things he did is that the conditioning test back then, and this is kind of mid-'80s, early mid-'80s, and late 80s, was a 12-minute run. And that was across the board. NFL, NCAA is a 12-minute run. How far would you get in 12 minutes? Something like that. I might get part of it wrong, but it was along that vein. And as the story goes, he went up to Jimmy Johnson. He says, hey, I'd like to change this to something that's a bit more football-centric. And that's where they started doing more like sprint, rest, because that's what they'll be doing as football players, especially in those skill position players. And the funny response from Jimmy Johnson was, but this is what the Dolphins do. The next year, the Dolphins were doing the Miami Hurricanes test, as was the rest of college and pro football, because it's just a lot more specific. And so that's why, to another screen share here. So this is something we created. It's actually called a vertical shuttle test because it made more sense now. But it's a one lateral step to a linear sprint. It's just the width of the court. It's like a shuttle run. But there's a plant and max jump at each position. So it's like you're doing a step, run, get in position, plant, and jump for a block, whatever it might be. Again, trying to make it a bit more sport specific. It's 10 jumps, takes 30 to 40 seconds. That's going to be more intense than anything you do in the court, but it's using the same movement you do in the court. Again, this is something you can do with or without a VERT. But what's neat is, I just like to show this one because it's hilarious. We've seen a few of these. This was an SEC player. You always start jumping to the left. This was a middle blocker who jumped 3 inches higher, loading to her right. She is actually now right side. They moved her position. But most importantly here is the other thing you can look at from a conditioning test is not just how fast this can be done, but how high can the athlete jump and can they maintain that? That's what we care about. With short rest or no rest, can they maintain that explosiveness over what's the average duration of play, right? You're looking at...
For a rally, it's like 7 seconds or something like that. Yeah, 10 seconds.
Exactly. So, to be honest, a mile run isn't going to tell you really anything about that. So, that's why we wouldn't necessarily do it. We'd be doing something more along the lines of this kind of an assessment that takes into account the movements they're doing, the type of fatigue they will see on the court, which is more intensity, plyometric, stop and go. So if we can mimic that in an assessment, and again, I would agree with Natosha there on the agility side. I wouldn't have them come in first thing and do that. But once we've built them up a little bit, yeah, we need to have that agility anyway, not just as an assessment, but we need that agility as a drill to build them back up. So yeah, there's the...
And I think in conditioning, the part that gets lost is that, like, this conditioning we're going to do is going to exactly prepare us to play. And it's like, well, actually, the majority of conditioning that we're doing is actually preparing us to recover from bouts of play. Like, right? Like, so it's not just like that test showed, it's go real fast and stop. Well, that's what volleyball is. So then you're doing this back and forth with, like, all right, if we're playing a ton of volleyball, how much volleyball-specific conditioning do I need to be doing? In actuality, I'm training the energy systems that allow us to be able to do what we call repeat power or repeat sprint ability. That is the capacity we're chasing. So if a mile builds a base, I could argue that a mile is still too fast to build a base. Like, it needs to actually be slower and less intense so that the heart rate can stay down enough to try to build out the capacities that level up to what volleyball is. But just, I think it's important to always remember, like, the best thing you're going to do to condition for volleyball is play volleyball. And the test that VERT has is as close to playing volleyball and being able to quantify it in a conditioning setting as possible. All the things you're doing that are below volleyball work to rest ratios and volleyball intensities, like, only just prepare you to recover between the bouts of volleyball. So it's important not to get caught up in quantifying all that under stuff. You got to quantify the volleyball and then just do enough of the under stuff to make sure we can recover in between the points that we need to play.
Yeah, we did, I guess the last point on that is we did something similar to this with USA Beach with a number of their athletes, where they did 3 jumps on the beach court, like 3 jumps, repeat, like max jump, 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 sprint across, max jump, 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 and then it's like 15 to 20 seconds rest. And the results, of course, we're looking at USA Beach national team players. But the results were amazing because you saw, like, let me get the numbers wrong, but like the first 3 jumps, like 25, 22, 22, sprint across, 23, 21, 21. But after the rest, he went right back to 25, 22, 22, 23, 21, 21. Rest, 25. Like, it was the same thing for all 3 rounds. That's what we want them to be able to do because there's so much rest in the sport. But that's also necessary because if there wasn't, those jump heights would go down and landings would inevitably go up because that, again, that kind of plyometric power, that intense explosiveness that's required in the sport.
And that's not to say we don't condition. We actually condition quite a bit, but it's never long duration, like a mile. And it's always extremely, like, targeted from an energy system perspective. So it's not that we're doing volleyball-specific intensities and heart rates all the time, but whatever we are doing is specifically targeted to build the anaerobic capacity and sometimes an anaerobic capacity to support the volleyball. So that's where kind of having a plan to build into that is important.
Come the 5th set, you want to make sure the libero isn't losing that half step, something that's virtually impossible to quantify, but that's where that kind of conditioning comes in and becomes important so that, you know, they're able to maintain that level of explosiveness and heart rate if necessary, because obviously in volleyball the heart rate's free all over the place. So yeah, there's your short answer to that question.
No problem. Anybody who wants to throw in questions, go ahead now. Like I said before, use the Q&A function. You brought up at the beginning of that talk the idea of using the mile as some sort of mental toughness test, and I'm with you. I agree with you that I don't see it. It's not it might be a mental toughness test of can I sustain a run for 8 minutes or whatever your mark is, but that's not a volleyball test. You never do that in volleyball. So why are you trying to test that in this other capacity?
Yeah,
if you think that much, libero gets a mile run in all around the court. That's about it.
You know, specificity is funny, right? Like, we care about specificity when we want to care about it. Like, we need things to be just like volleyball. It's like, well, we don't need everything to be just like volleyball. And then it's like, let's go run a mile. And it's like, but I thought you wanted everything to be like volleyball. So it's important sometimes to be really, really specific, and then other times it's not. It's just kind of knowing where to draw those lines. The mental toughness part, like, we could go down another long rabbit hole with that, but I believe that it's a built-in, consistent, daily, like, reinforced thing amongst your team and amongst your team culture and amongst your coaches. That stuff is not. We did not go out, run a mile, everybody passed, therefore we are mentally tough. That does not mean in the fifth set that we're not just going to, like, tank due to the pressure because we all passed the mile 4 months ago. Like, that's...
Well, for mental toughness, I'll tell you this, and this is for both athletes and coaches. There was, and I'm going to get some of this information to share, John, because I think it's really important. Some of our colleagues at the University of Calgary Institute of Sports Research and Injury Prevention, they did a really fascinating study. This was on youth basketball athletes. What they did, got over 350 of them. They're doing a neuromuscular training warm-up. It's a fancy way of just saying a very, sports-specific, good, strategic movement warm-up. And it was between 10 to 15 minutes before every practice or even PE classes. And what they found was from an acute injury, so again, like those tears, those injuries that knock you out, there was a decrease of up to 70% that season on their group that was doing the neuromuscular warm-up training. And yet still, when they finished the study, they stopped doing a lot of the neuromuscular warm-up training, even after seeing the fact that it helped that much. And with that, again, we're talking about acute, because again, there's acute and chronic injuries. To be clear, those kind of things, those kind of neuromuscular training development, those warm-ups, priming the body, priming the central nervous system, getting those movement patterns set and good and warm, those have shown a massive decrease in acute injury. But the only way they've seen to really decrease chronic injury broadly was on load progression, right? Kind of taking this back to where we started. Yeah. So those are, again, two different things because you have to tackle several different variables here when we're talking about athlete health. But I'm trying to get some more information on that I'll be able to share with you to send out to people because I think it's massively important. And it's very, very simple. You just have to have the mental toughness and make it a habit to get people to move properly as they warm up, treat warm up like it's a game instead of you see those athletes who are just goofing off and their mechanics are crap during warm up because they're not paying attention, not realizing that absolutely has a carryover effect to what they're going to start doing when they start actually playing. So, yeah, just another aside that I think is very important.
Okay. We had another question from Michael. This, again, is probably conditioning related, but has to do with how we train. So are you both familiar with wash drills, wash games and drills that we use? So he's wondering, since in a wash situation, you're normally feeding a ball in right away after a rally's done. He's wondering how long should you go in one of these rally situations before you stop and let the players rest. He's talking like you could be a 60 to 90 minute sequence. 60 to 90 second sequence of continuous play.
So, I think and this is where my coaches are extremely successful because they do what they do and I do what I do, right? Like, let's say I said, like, if for me, that's not super indicative of volleyball. If that's a decision that my coach has made of, like, we're not necessarily doing, like, match play right now, but I want us to work on keeping our focus for X amount of time, trying to do this, that's decisional. From a work-to-rest scientific perspective, is that super indicative of volleyball? No. But from that is where I let my coaches, like, make that decision and be very targeted about what they're trying to do. the reasoning behind it is probably beyond my scope, and I'm good with that. Now, if you're doing it for conditioning, that makes sense, but I would argue it has to be pretty well planned, right? So that you don't have like one person doing a ton of the work and another person not really doing anything. But you know what I mean? That is what you see a lot when you try to mix the volleyball and the conditioning. As a strength coach, I see it a ton from a standpoint of this is a high-intensity conditioning drill with a ball. It's like, awesome. But is she doing the same work to rest as she is? Because in this drill, the libero's passing, and now the libero's too tired to get the ball to where it needs to go to get the set to the middle. So the middle's actually standing there for a long time while the setter and the libero run back and forth. So I think that's the things you kind of need to be careful with when you start doing that. But again, as far as like how long is too long, it all depends on what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, and the other part of the closest example I can give you, again, from kind of a data perspective, if you're looking at to make it, as conditioning and volleyball specific, Shane White, the head coach at Waterloo Men's in Canada, and I'm going to get some of the durations wrong, but one of the things they did that they found to be very successful, similar concept, was they said, all right, we know that our middles, they run through a cycle. They're on the front line for an average of, I forget what it was, let's say 2 minutes, and they jump eight times on average per cycle. And they said, so if we know that's what they do in a match, what he would just do in practice is he'd run them through those cycles with a little less rest than they get in match, but the whole front row is running through it at the same time, doing roughly the same amount of jumps they would do in a match or a little more. I think that might more specifically kind of speak to what Mike was trying to get at, is saying like, yeah, you can try to make it what they're doing in match, right? We're trying to do that most of the time. But if you're trying to build up any kind of conditioning there, like, yeah, obviously, like Natosha said, you want to be insanely organized. You want even distribution of that rest and work. But at the same time, the way I'd like to look at it from a simplicity standpoint is if we have an idea of what it looks like on average in a match, we can make it a little bit more intense, especially something like that in practice for, a slightly longer duration. But again, the wash drill is mainly just, if I heard you correctly, a lot more just passing. Run me through that a little more specifically.
It depends. Well, for example, there might be a wash might be, okay, the initial rally starts with a serve. You play it out. As soon as the ball's dead, you initiate a second ball in some fashion. It could be a free ball, it could be a defense ball, whatever you're working on. There are certain ones of those that will keep going until one team, say, gets 3 in a row, or you fulfill some criteria, or sometimes it's just 2 balls or 3 balls and you stop.
Yeah,
so it depends on what you're working on.
Yeah, so then the question is, to Natosha's point, who's doing most of the work there? You're kind of watching them. And then if you do want to have some kind of strategy behind it, because I've talked to a number of programs that we've actually cut down on the number of rounds we do on some of these drills because we've noticed that, wow, we just got, if they are monitoring it, we just got X amount of jumps from just this drill, with these 3 players, and frick, we need them working on something else. And so then it becomes more about practice efficiency in terms of where do you want that load coming from on what skill. So in terms of duration of time, yeah, that's how I would look at it, is how much time in general do I just want to spend on this kind of drill in terms of the load we're accumulating for that practice versus can it be used better elsewhere, and is it kind of being spread fairly equally across the board, if that makes sense.
And I've seen us do in practice, or we've done in practice multiple times, to in practice, okay, I want us to be focused in for this amount of time, and I want us to get this done. And I don't think our approach to that is ever this is just like a match, or this is preparing us exactly for what we're going to see in a match. It's just more, it's very targeted and very this is what our focus is right now. Forget everything else. And that's okay. Again, that's one of those decisional coach things that's why I stay to the side and look at my VERT iPad and let everybody else on with coaching.
Yeah, I mean, to the point about balancing the load, Michael and everybody else, one of the things that you can be thinking about in terms of that planning, if you do want to do those drills, is maybe how you initiate the balls or what that next ball is shifts the focus to a different player set. So it goes from being something where the outside hitters are taking swings to, or the focus now shifts to the middle hitters or to the right sides or to the libero or, whatever, so that you're shifting around who's the central focus for that particular segment and maybe kind of balancing things a bit. Something to think about.
Yeah.
Won't necessarily be easy to do, but something to think about.
That's just also skill work right there, because I wouldn't necessarily be worried about, like, within the drill itself, overworking anybody by not giving rest in between serves. It's just, again, are certain people doing more work than others, and how much work do we want to be done in that drill relative to what we're trying to accomplish in that day's practice, right? Because that's where you start to see, jump numbers. You're just running through, and then you look and you find out your middle's at 130 jumps, and you've got an hour left in practice. Well, we should not continue this for the rest of practice, because
send them home.
Jumps, but yeah, in a nutshell.
David, was there anything else from the thing that you sent me that you thought people might be particularly interested?
Well, I think what I can do, John, is kind of pull this up really quickly, and this is a bit as an aside. Make sure you're sharing my screen properly. Can you see this fall practice review here?
Yep.
I was going through. So this is just something that we've been doing. We're going to be putting up a thing on our website where anybody can just say, hey, I'd like to request these reports, and we'll be sending them out for free. This is something we do with our advanced clients, do like comparisons between conference, things of that nature. But at this time, we just think the education is hyper important. But it's just looking at, what is, springs, how many jumps are we missing right now, right? Natosha's not going to sit there and say, all right, cool, I need my outside jumping 100 times a day at home. So instead, what we've talked about is saying, like, all right, well, of those jumps, about 26 of them are maximal, over 20 inches. So a lot of coaches have been using this as a guide to say, if we are having them do any kind of maximal jumps, which one doing some work, ideally, while they're at home, here's a guide at least to say, here's where you can sort of start and then progress from here. I don't want the athletes in their house jumping 133 times max volleyball style jumps. Like, yeah, as you'll see in some of our videos, a lot more of those like low level plyo, pogo stick, lateral hops to kind of build that capacity. But we don't, again, that's also really boring, 133 jumps out of volleyball in your house. And then just going over again, this is what we've looked at for spring practices week over week. And then, average jump counts per match, jumps over 20 inches per match. Just insights that we want coaches to be able to use to help guide, but also just start asking questions about your own programs. Like, hey, do we fall in this periodization? Is this periodization the best way to do it, especially this year? But yeah, we'll make this available, and I'll let you know as soon as we have this kind of in a nice little package for people to grab.
All right, yeah. I did a thing yesterday that involved Kathy DeBoer talking about what she's hearing, what's going to come up for the fall season, because she does right now expect there to be a fall season, but there sounds like there's going to be potentially a lot of variability as to when people will be allowed to start preseason, how many matches they're going to have, because she said one school told her you're not going to be able to get in more than 19 matches this year, which is the minimum requirement. Somebody was told you're basically not going to have a preseason because we can't afford to bring on all the athletes, for 3 weeks before school starts. So there's definitely going to be a lot of challenges out there for coaches and strength coaches and all that support to try to work out, well, okay, how do we safely and effectively ramp the players up to play? And do you sacrifice some portion of your season to keep the focus on just preparation so that when maybe you get into conference, you're kind of starting to get on a good level?
I think just to follow up on that point, like when you say sacrifice, I agree, but that sacrifice doesn't necessarily have to come in the form of like, we're just tanking out this preseason part, you know? Like we could really be, I think if there is a strategic volume load plan there, both in the weight room, on the court, it actually is not as like wildly dire, I think, as it could be. Like even if they said, all right, we're back, you got 2 weeks until you start to play, you know, we would have to be unbelievably efficient in our practices. One, unbelievably efficient with whatever time was given in the weight room. Two, but like the mindset's going to need to change a little bit. That in season, we just can't have these like high peaks. Like here's the plan, guys. All right, this week we're jumping this many times. This week we're jumping this many times. Such on and so forth. Just like that reverse periodization that David showed, like relative to what David showed. Just the reverse of that. And then from a weight room perspective, if done correctly, you can really like build volume in smartly in season. And that's like, all right, coaches, we're sitting down first before the ladies even make it back to campus. We're going to lift on these days throughout the rest of the season. Like that is what the plan is. We can change what's going to happen in the lift, but let's nail down what these lift days are. And it's just going to require just like very intense collaboration. But I think the biggest thing I'm trying to like just get across to everybody is like, no matter what, it's going to be okay. But even if we had a great plan and you decided one day, we didn't pass well, let's play for another 45 minutes and jump another 115 times. It's going to blow whatever plan right out of the window. The best plan will be destroyed. It's going to be that one day of like this gnarly spike that's going to like just mess everything up. So something to think about.
John, I think that's the thing, that the sacrifice you're really referring to is like our play may not be where we want it to be. Okay, worth it. We will kind of theoretically make the argument, and then on top of that, from what we've seen, what I've seen, I think what you've seen as well is everyone's talking about this. So it's almost going to be this kind of a if it's more of this like across the board progression, then a lot of it's going to balance out, right? Yeah. But then by the time we get into conference play, which is what we care about anyway, and you want to use those beginning matches, again, if we have them, depending on what we have, to just get some of that chaos into the training, right? You're almost using those matches as training. Then yeah, I think it's fine. And there was another webinar I was going to jump onto. I have to listen to it recorded, but the guy was talking about like, do we see an increase in injury, or do we actually see some amazing performance, like in the middle end of the season, right? Because how much more focused programs, a lot of programs are going to have on sticking to that plan for exactly the reason Natosha mentioned, right? It could be, frankly, it could be one of those silver lining things. The things I'm hearing from coaches, from the sports science perspective, is such music to my ears that this has been such an amazing time of education, of asking questions, of saying, all right, let's look back at what we've done, and we're going to have to do it differently. So we're going to have to reevaluate. And can we learn something new in the process that we can take over to the following year, which will be completely normal, and improve. So, again, you look at the bright spots. I think that's a big one, barring all the horrific budgeting in sports and sports taking cuts and all those things that are fairly important too that Kathy talked about. But on the performance side, yeah, especially if you're smart, you're proactive, you have a plan, programs can come out on top, absolutely.
Yeah, I think it comes back to, something that you should always be shooting for anyway is, can you be efficient and effective with the time that you're going to have, whatever that's going to be, and whatever condition your athletes are going to be when you get them, or are you going to waste time? Yeah, exactly. and maybe at the end of the day, we'll have a lot more effective and efficient coaches, like you said, for the next season when things get back to something approaching normal.
Yep.
All right. I just had a question pop in. So there's some programs that are going to have more limitations on strength and conditioning than others. Where do we find the right resources to make up for the lack of expertise in head coaches? That's a good question.
Very good question. Natosha, you can start because you're going to be providing some of that on even your channel.
Right.
But that's also some stuff I'll be submitting to John to spread out here soon.
Perfect. So I think, not that my YouTube channel is like the end-all be-all, but it's basic things that like anyone can do for the most part. Like it's literally some stuff that we've sent to like our incoming freshmen that I haven't had a chance to coach yet. So that's like one resource. But I get that like that's tough, right? Like it's my job to like know the parts of this that my coaches don't, or that my coaches maybe aren't as versed in. But I think some of the best like resources you can kind of look into are honestly just feel free to like reach out to collegiate strength coaches. Like sure, I'm putting stuff on my Instagram page. Sure, I'm trying to be as in working with David as outward as possible just so we can keep people healthy. But you'd be hard pressed to come across a strength coach right now that's not A, losing their mind because they're sitting in the house all day and that's not what we do. But B, that won't just like help, right? Like so, I will put my email in the chat. And if anybody wants to reach out, like I wish there was like you go to this website, you'll find all the jumps and all the whatever. There are some cool websites that have some good information, but I'm always very careful about that because I don't want to vouch for every single thing that's on that page. So whether it's me or another collegiate strength coach from a program, like people are really good about getting back. So my suggestion would just be if you don't have a strength coach to kind of reference or use, to reach out to some collegiate strength coaches because a lot of people are more than happy to help.
Yeah, and again, you can reach out to us as well, performance@myvert.com, and there are things that Natosha and I are actually doing videos on basic things you can do that I'm in contact with AVCA that they also might be sending out just purely for educational. All it is the key is, and this is always a challenge from the sports performance coach perspective, is there's these litany of things we can do, but in the end, admittedly, and it sounds like this person asking questions like, all right, maybe I'm a coach. I don't have a strength conditioning program that I can lean on. This isn't your area of expertise. So the most important thing is to make sure you have the basics down of basic movements and basic progressions in terms of loads and reps. I know that's probably what you're looking for, because there's a lot you can get done with a lot of basic movements. And that's a lot of the neuromuscular training things that I was talking about earlier, those strategies. They have those built out with like diagrams, pictures, it's body weight stuff. It's very basic, literally designed so that, a teacher could do it if you're, again, think of that high school population. You're a teacher who, they needed a coach for volleyball. So now you're a volleyball coach and you're running everything there. That stuff exists. So again, I'm in the process of compiling as much as I can that, has been thoroughly vetted to say this is a very good starting point. But yeah, like Natosha's been absurdly open. This is not about competitive advantages. This is about a global perspective of keeping athletes healthy at all populations. So we're again, reach out. We'll help however we can, really.
Yeah, and it's just like with other volleyball coaches. The people in the field are usually really open to having conversations if you just ask them. Buy them a cup of coffee or something like that. And there tends to be a lot of strength coaches who farm themselves out, for lack of a better term, to club programs or whatever to make a little extra money. So it might be a situation where you can have somebody come in for a day and work with players and take them through proper technique in the weight room or with whatever exercises you've got them doing. So it doesn't have to be something full-time. It could just be, okay, this person comes in and helps me out once in a while to make sure we got everything going right. All right.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I think the last point I want to make is like just to reiterate what David is saying, it does not need to be complicated, like at all. If you can teach them how to land, and to keep in mind, we get pretty good recruits here, and most of them cannot land. And like when I say land, I mean like jump on 2 feet and land. the right way and attenuate force the right way, and it's tough. So, right, if you can nail stuff like that down and be smart about your progression into the season, like that's really going to be the core of what you're looking at. You don't have to be doing a ton of super advanced plyos and all that. You know, that stuff is helpful down the road. It doesn't need to be unbelievably complicated.
Actually, since you brought up the teaching them how to land thing, because this is a question that comes up quite a bit, especially with juniors, is should we be encouraging them to land 2 feet all the time, or at least as much as we could possibly get them to land 2 feet, or is it more about landing in control based on whatever hitting technique that they've had, like coming off of a slide or certain types of outside swings or stuff like that?
Well, I'll start off, and then I think I could almost verbatim give Natosha's answer, but I'll let her do it. And this is going to depend on the coaches you talk to, right? You talk to Coach Dunning, and he's going to say, I want 2 feet landing every single time, no matter what. You land on 1 foot 3 times in practice, you're out kind of concept. And some players responded better to that, changed their movement, and did start landing better. Look, ideally, if we can dissipate that force with 2 legs, great. The fact of the matter is that isn't always going to happen. So while we can coach them to land in this ideal manner, we need to prep them, and I'll kind of let Natosha take from here, prep them to land in non-ideal manners.
Yeah. Now this is, I'm going to try to keep this as succinct as possible. I know we're getting at the end of this. We teach everyone to land and dissipate forces relatively the same, and you know it's going to look differently on everybody and on 2 feet. I think when it comes to landing in match, this idea that we should always land on 2 feet, I almost think it's a little impossible. So I feel like there's a line where it's safe, not safe. In 1 foot landings, I think it's more about the control and more about the ability to dissipate. Again, I'm fortunate to have VERT, right? So we have somebody that's out there landing really, really awfully. I can quantify that and see. But we do have some that land with a ton of force, and it's left, right, and it dissipates fine. They attenuate it fine. And we talked a little about crumple zone, and even on one leg, if you can land and then attenuate that and then recover with the other leg, it's still okay. So I think I kind of look at it does this fall into the range of safe that I'm okay with? And then we supplement that in the weight room with making sure that we never see a position on the court or a landing on the court that we have not seen in a controlled environment. Or a range, I think is even more of a way to talk about it. Can you pistol squat? Can you single leg squat? Can you be strong in deep range positions? When we see that torque on the court, we better be prepared for it. It better not be the first time we see it. But as far as we all need to land on 2 feet, or we all need to land on whatever, my coaches can kind of speak to what they talk about. But I do think it's, once we get into gameplay, it doesn't matter what we show them. It just matters if we've taken that conscious ability to attenuate force and made it a little bit more subconscious and given them the ability to kind of understand it, if that makes sense.
Definitely does. Okay, any final comments, David, before we wrap up?
I think that's good. I actually have a 15 minutes until I have a panel with Natosha with a group of sports science professionals that we've come together. We're actually doing some work with the high school strength conditioning associations to help provide some guidelines for that population, which theoretically could be at greater risk, right? So, this is pretty much constantly what we're working on now. But no, I think, again, if anybody has any questions, I know you'll share the contact, myvert.com. They can literally click a link that goes into my calendar to schedule a conversation. And as you can see, a lot of the conversations is not even VERT specific. We're really, it's just, we have data. We're trying to use the data to educate. to make sure that we keep these athletes as healthy as humanly possible leading back into play.